Anthony is my wonderful colleague from CBS News, a very talented man, and he brings great insight into how we cover politics in this country and gives producers like myself great direction at CBS News. Anthony, let's begin. You've got a CBS poll hot off the press on Sunday. Headline, Democrats lead continues to grow in race for House, CBS News background tracker. What are you telling us here? Democrats are going to do it?
First of all, thank you, and thank everybody. Thank you all for coming out. It's really just an honor to be here. So thanks to World Affairs for having us out here, and thank you, Chris. The fun part here is that Chris didn't mention is that it turns out we were talking this afternoon, and Chris used to work with my old boss, Kathy Frankovic, back when they were putting together polling pieces and putting together graphics for polls. And then I met Jeff, who is used to actually, when you were in med school, right? I used to make phone calls back when CBS had its own room where the phone calls were made for the poll right there from CBS. So this has been fun to kind of catch up, because one of the fun things, there's also an honor to do about being at CBS and doing the polling is that there is this long history there. I mean, I've got these faded old notebooks of old questionnaires going back from, the Reagan era. I've got old printouts from when they were calling the race for LBJ on these old green line computer printouts. So it's fun to hear from folks and think back on all the tradition that we still kind of try to carry on. So fast forwarding to this year, what we did with the Battleground Tracker was we have been surveying a concentrated in battleground congressional districts, probably the 60-odd races out of the 435 that will most likely swing control of the House. And what we do with that is we put that into a model that incorporates, obviously, the vote choices of all the people we talk to, also characteristics spanning across the districts, and we've been tracking how many seats each party would win if the election were held now. So our initial estimate for this week, we came out with 226 for the Democrats. With a margin of error on that, that's obviously a little over the 218 that they would need to take the House. With a margin of error on that of 14 seats. And I know sometimes people go, oh, that's a big margin of error. It's 5% of the House. So it's not entirely, it's fairly analogous to what a conventional poll would be. But then, and this is partly coming out of lessons learned over the past couple of cycles, I often talk about the range of possibilities. 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, you might have talked about undecided voters more. There just aren't that many of them these days. But we certainly see a lot of people who often say they're going to turn out but don't. And so, you hear the old cliche, oh, it all comes down to turnout, blah, blah, blah. But it really is true this year. So we thought, well, what do we do, and how do we explain this in terms of the possibilities, the range of outcomes that could happen beyond just this margin of error, the statistical thing? So we took our current model and we assumed that all the people who are telling us that they're going to vote do show up. We make the electorate look a lot more like a presidential year turnout, with younger voters, with more suburban voters than a typical midterm. We reran the model and we got the number for the Democrats at 235. Seems to be like the high end where they could max out if everything breaks their way. But then the other really compelling part was we said, what if none of those folks show up? What if this ends up looking like a more typical midterm where you get something under 40% total turnout, the electorate is much older, it tends to be more conservative. We ran that model, and we also said, what about all these folks who are telling us they're going to show up, telling us they voted maybe in past presidential years, but they don't typically vote in midterms? Those folks in the polling right now are breaking heavily Dems. We took them out, reran it, and we had the Dems at 217 and the Republicans getting the 218, in other words, holding the House. So the sort of long story short on this is there is still a range of possibilities out there, and the Democrats' chances still hinge very heavily on getting people who don't typically show up in midterms to show up. So when you hear us pollsters say it all comes down to turnout, that's not just a hedge, and we're not just trying to be cute. There really is a sort of path of possibilities that stems out of that, and that's sort of the top line of what we found.
So we boiled it down to the sort of, we're going to go to the polls, people they tell you, but maybe we're not going to go to the polls after all because they usually don't. This is the undependable voter.
When you're doing, one of the biggest struggles, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, but one of the biggest struggles for us as pollsters is obviously not just measuring what people say and think, but what they might do about it. But we also have to recognize that oftentimes they may really mean what they say when they tell us we're going to vote, but oftentimes life gets in the way. You might, have to drop your kid off at school. You might have a boss that doesn't let you, stay away from the office or the workplace long enough to stand in line. Things may happen. You may not actually show up. We often find in polling that people tend to over-report what they, their propensity to turn out. So we're always trying to gauge to what degree that's going to be, and that part is, we say it's an unknown, but it's really something that we have one of our biggest struggles trying to determine.
Well, I think people are fascinated to know about who are these people that you poll. I mean, I don't know how many people in this room have actually ever received a phone call, but of a population of 327 million people in the country, you're talking to about 1,000?
In a typical phone poll, yeah. Now, the battleground tracker is far larger, actually. The battleground tracker incorporates some 5,000 interviews in the congressional districts and tens of thousands from others. But the point being, your chances are still pretty low.
Yeah, it's a far cry from 327
your chances are
million
very
people
low.
there. So there's a lot of people that you're probably not reaching. So how do we know that these numbers are for real?
It starts with the idea of representation, the idea that even if we don't talk to you, we have talked to somebody who's enough like you. Everyone's unique. Everyone has their own background, their experiences. The joke I kind of make is that, you're not special. And people go, but in the regards and the things we're trying to measure, you aren't in this sense. If you're of a certain age, there are tens of millions of people who fall into that category along with you. If you're a Republican, there are 40 million voters who share that characteristic with you. Now, there are different types of Republicans, there are different types of Democrats, but even so, you're going to be in the company of tens of millions of people. So, well, the way it works is, and the analogy I use in the book is my grandmother's spaghetti sauce, where you didn't have that
Bolognese
sauce. It depends on where I go. Actually, where I can say bolognese. I can say bolognese in San Francisco, probably because you have a great food scene here, and plenty of Italian Americans. Some places I say spaghetti, but the thing is, this is a riff on an old pollster's analogy where it came, George Gallup used to say you don't have to drink the whole bowl of soup in order to know how it tastes. You just, take a teaspoon. I thought of my grandmother's Bolognese sauce when I was learning it, so I kind of used that. But the point is, you only have to taste a bowl to know how the whole vat tastes. The mechanism for that is that the piece of garlic that you get is like enough to the pieces of garlic back in the vat that you can measure that dimension of taste, and the piece of meat like the piece of meat, the grain of salt like the grain of salt. So that's how the idea of putting together a representative sample works. You're putting together that world in microcosm. The way that we do that has changed over the years. And
we were going to get to that, which is it's no longer, Ward or June Cleaver picking up the phone or their surrogates, but in fact, it's the internet now, it's cell phones, a combination of all.
Right.
You can talk about how it was and how it is today.
Right. It used to be primarily landlines, and you could reach people at home. You could reach more people at home. Okay, they came home from work at 5 or 6 o'clock, and then you got the call in the evening. But today, that's just not the case. People work longer. They have caller ID. They don't have landlines anymore. Today, we dial 70%, we complete 70% of our interviews on cell phones. And I know a lot of people will say, oh, you don't call cell phones. Some polls that are maybe more suspect methodologically don't call cell phones and only call landlines. But that's something you should avoid. We do call cell phones, and that means it takes longer. Because even a cell phone, people don't necessarily pick it up, or they may not be in a place where they can have the conversation. What it means effectively is that we have to dial many more thousands of numbers in a phone poll, including those cell phones, in order to get the same size sample that it used to take. It used to be much faster for pollsters to get. That's the phone side. On the internet side, pollsters have had to go where people have gone. So as people have gotten online, as internet access and broadband access expanded, the people who were online, diversified and became more representative. And it's more convenient for people to take polls online. And that is where we do the bulk of our polling, including the battleground polling now. We have large online panels. We work with a vendor based here in San Francisco, and that's YouGov America. And part of this came out of a friend and colleague at CBS, Doug Rivers, who did a lot of the pioneering work on this back. He's at Stanford. And long and short of it is that you have enough people on this panel, you can get a representative sample by putting it together so that it forms this microcosm of the country along the lines of what the census parameters are. And so a lot of folks take the survey online. We sample them. They don't opt in directly to the survey. They join the panel, but we send them the survey. And then from there, the advantages of that are that it's private and it's faster for people to take. You can take it wherever you like. You can take a poll from us on your smartphone, not just as a cell phone pickup, but with a little interface that you click the buttons. You can take it at your desktop at your convenience. And we find that the response rate is good, it's representative, and it does avoid a lot of the issues where you're not talking to somebody and maybe you're shy about saying something, as polls have often speculated. You can just click away.
Now, with those cell phones, do you ever get the block this caller?
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't want to hear from you again.
Yeah. That's one of the things. Anytime you're reaching or you're trying to reach someone and you can't for whatever reason, you've just got to do the work of going out and finding, hopefully along the way, you'll find somebody enough like them. And then that leads into the whole discussion of weighting a survey, because you will, look, whether you're doing it online or you're doing it by phone, younger people are hard to reach. People who work longer hours are harder to reach. People of lower economic situations can be harder to reach, and that means you have to make more adjustments. You're weighting, in most cases, you're weighting to census targets. But if you don't have enough people in your sample that your sample properly reflects the census target, then each of those people in the sample needs to carry additional weight to continue to represent the people you miss. And when you do that, you risk a bias. You risk in the statistical sense, you risk a bias in your sample.
You point out in your book that in order to get a representative sample of, say, 25 of 1,000 people, you have to start with a pool of about 25,000 and just cull that down from non-working numbers to, the biased aspect to on and on. I mean, that's a tremendous selection process just to get to your representative sample. Right. You point out, how polling has changed. Has the electorate changed?
Yeah, in a lot of ways. So let's start with, for one thing, partisanship. Right, and that probably won't surprise anybody, but we see less crossover voting than pollsters did a generation ago. So today you will see well over 90% of Republicans vote for a Republican, Democrats vote for a Democrat. It's part of the reason that most House seats stay where they are, or at least with the party that they're with. And you used to see, even if you go back to the 80s, you might see a quarter. You did see a quarter of Democrats vote for a Republican for the House, vice versa, and that's gone now. So, in part, you can sort of expect what someone will do based on their partisanship. It's not a perfect measure, but it's certainly there. And that's one way. That's one of the biggest ways that we see that's the change. A lot of people, more people of late, identify as independents. I should qualify that while I'm talking about this partisanship. However, when we also ask independents what they typically do, the bulk of them say that they usually vote for one party. So they call themselves independent, and maybe once in a great while they'll switch over. But for the most part, they're effectively partisan, but call themselves independent.
We'll talk about the entrenchment of attitudes a little bit later, but I wanted to sort of cut to the chase on Pollster's, I guess, worst nightmare, the 2016 election. Your book, you point out that when you walked down the hall one day about 3 days before, you bumped into Major Garrett, the lead political reporter for CBS News, and you both looked at each other and said, Trump could win. Trump could win. And that's because you saw the trending data, I guess, in battleground locations. Mm-hmm. But Pollster's got sort of punched in the nose, I guess, for that election, saying, well, you got it all wrong. So explain yourself.
Discuss.
Explain yourself, yes.
Got it wrong. Discuss. No, look, even going around talking about this, talking about 2016, talking about the book, it still is the question that comes up the most, and we have to address it, and I do address it in the book, but I'll say it. The first blush answer from a lot of pollsters is, hey, wait a second, the polls were a lot better than you think. If you look at the national polls, they were actually more accurate, closer to the final national vote, than 2012's were. Hillary Clinton won the national vote by a couple points, and that's where most of the national polls had it. It's a great example of having an accurate number that doesn't tell the right story. And it's a lesson in making sure you look at the number that tells you the right story. So obviously, the national popular vote doesn't decide the presidency, and the states did. Now, do I wish that more pollsters had done more polling in the Michigans and the Wisconsins and even the Minnesotas of the world? Absolutely. And I think a lot of people might have seen more had there been more polling. So second lesson out of that is make sure you go where the action is. Don't assume say how a state or how a place is going to go. And by the way, part of that is something we carry forward now into 2018, where we're doing these battleground districts, concentrating in the places that swing stuff. And just riffing off of that for a second, it's why I really caution a lot of people to keep at arm's length these polls that are still putting out the national generic ballot for Congress. That's a straightforward poll to do. It's, you call everybody in the country and you get, I saw one the other day was Dem plus 9, one the other day was Dem plus 8. That's fine. It might even be accurate, but does it tell you the story? That poll, just like the national poll didn't tell you the story of what was going on in a Pennsylvania or a Wisconsin in 2016, that national poll you see today is going to have people in the sample from a ruby red district in Oklahoma and a deep blue district over in Berkeley or on the west side of Manhattan. Those folks are in your numbers too. So you want to look at where the action is. And I do see more pollsters now doing these concentrated polls in the competitive districts. Back to 2016 for a second, another respect. One of the things to emphasize is that a poll is not a prediction. And again, when a pollster says that, it can sound like a dodge. Well, it's okay if I'm not accurate because it's not a prediction. I get that. But what I encourage people to demand of their pollsters or whoever is giving you polling information is, explain the world and explain it in terms of people and opinions and possibilities, not just game it out in terms of probabilities, because this is not a dice game. These are arguments going back and forth. These are some people, vacillating back and forth, whether to turn out, whether to consider a candidate, etc. One of the things that we saw in 2016, and we repeatedly said, though it doesn't always cut through, was that there was a proportionally substantial group of Republicans who had said, they were in the polls, they told us that they were reticent to back then candidate Trump. And we said, well, this is about 10%, a little higher, a little lower, depending on the state. And then, this seemed to make sense as part of the narrative, right? I mean, he had a contentious primary and, maybe he would get this attrition from the party. That was certainly a reason he was lagging Hillary Clinton in a lot of these polls. But you looked at their profile. Again, consider people, consider their possibilities. And you said, well, they call themselves conservatives, they call themselves Republicans, and they don't agree with Hillary Clinton on any other issue, and they're not considering voting for Hillary Clinton. So if these folks do decide to vote, what do you think they're going to do, right? That's a range of possibilities. It's not statistical, it's not a margin of error, it's in terms of people. So we talked about that, and if those folks come home, this thing's going to get a lot closer. Maybe some of that got drowned out, right? Maybe some, Clinton will still win, blah, blah. So again, here, if you consider the range of possibilities, if you consider it like it's a campaign, a persuasion campaign, which is what is going on, then I think you're less surprised by what could happen. And, I think that's part of the 2016 story as well. You want to see that range of possibilities. In the end, just to wrap this up, in the end, we saw enormous numbers of late deciders, late breakers, told us in the exit polls that they had voted for Donald Trump, and he won all those late deciders in all those key states. And guess what? They were more conservative, they were more moderate, they came back. But that was the kind of thing, that was part of why we thought, hey, maybe. Nobody said outright, I'm predicting. But yeah, could this happen? Yeah, it was definitely a possibility.
It was in the numbers. It was a true confessions here of the pollster about the 2016. You have to get away with it. Yeah. Exit polls. Those are the ones. There's a fascinating story that Anthony tells in his book about, first of all, of about 174,000 precincts in the country. You are looking at 0.0004% of Americans are included in exit polls on election night. And this is data which is held very tightly. There's a secret location in New York City, which you described going to. You check your cell phone at the door. There's no electronics allowed in. And you all start looking at this throughout the day. Want to pick it up from there?
Well,
and you're let out at the other end, obviously.
We are. Yes, we are. We're allowed. It's you can check out anytime you like, but you can.
Good to hear.
And you can leave. Well, what happens with the exit polls? Here's how they work. The precincts, when you see us, when you watch us on election night, what we and the other networks will have done is randomly selected precincts from all over the state. If people voted for absentees, as they do predominantly here in California and other western states, we've called them on the phone. But for states that vote in person, we randomly select the precincts. There are no bellwether precincts. There's no we go to this town because it always votes for the winner. If anybody tells you that, it's hooey. That's not how we do it. And so that everybody has the chance of being selected if they're voting there that day or someplace that day. And the interviewer stands there, picks every certain person that comes past, offers them the exit poll. They collect that data, transmit it back to the networks where we do look at it throughout the day. And one of the things you can see is that trend line developing, that pattern developing. But you also want to analyze who's left to vote, who's still out there to vote. One of the things that happened in 2016 was that although Hillary Clinton did very well in the early vote and in a lot of places in the absentee vote, she was losing the election day vote, the people who came out that day. And so it was clear even then that the people still left, the kinds of precincts that were reporting, the people still left were potentially more for Trump. That comes in waves throughout the day, and when you see us at poll close characterize a race, that's on the basis of the exit polls, the interviews that we've collected from voters. But there's a couple more steps. The next step is that interviewer then goes in to the precinct official. They're pre-credentialed, and they've got this all prearranged with elections officials, and they go to the county, and they get the counts once they tally up the actual votes from that precinct. And then we use those votes from the precinct to overwrite, replace, correct any differences from what people coming out have told us. And that's why over the course of the evening, okay, polls have closed. Now I'm going to tell you that it's, edging to Dem or edging Republican. Wait, we're getting more data. We're getting those precinct counts. And that data is coming in, so we're seeing that. And then finally, we're getting the county vote, either streamed directly in, and that's the total aggregate votes from, San Francisco or wherever else. And that goes in as well. And then what our job there is to look for is patterns across the state. When enough data is in, when the patterns are such that we've got representation from everywhere, from all kinds of different places, and that's when we can start to say we can project a race. That's when we will.
So you weight the exit poll data against actual vote data, and you combine it to do your projection?
The exit poll data is eventually replaced by essentially
right.
the actual vote.
Right.
So it's kind of like we call it an exit poll, but it's really an exit operation. Yeah, it's this collection operation, talking to people, and then getting precinct counts, then ultimately getting county counts, so that you're seeing this picture unfold. That no counties count exactly at the same time. Precincts don't all come in at the same time, so you're kind of like getting this. It's unfolding like a puzzle, turning over piece by piece until, as pollsters are wont to do, you see a consistent pattern.
Can you talk about presidential approval ratings? I guess George Gallup came up with the idea of doing this in the 1920s, and we've been checking on what Americans think of presidents ever since. This president's approval ratings are different than some of his immediate predecessors in that they're relatively constant at around, do I have it at 40%?
Low 40s.
Late high 30s in there.
Sometimes, yeah.
Whereas George Bush, after 9/11, I guess it was up 91%, just shot up. Obama had some Richter scale activity as well. What's going on with this one that makes it different?
You're right. This is the most stable we've seen in CBS News polling. No matter what events happen, the president stays in that sort of low 40s range. It speaks to, and before him, President Obama also started to show some of this pattern. It speaks to our hyperpartisan era, really, in that he's got extremely low approval from Democrats and has since the start of his term. He's got extremely high approval from Republicans and has since the start of his term, and that doesn't really waver. Within sampling error, a couple points here and there, it does not waver depending on events, and that is something we have not seen in the past. In the past, you can see where as the economy gets better, presidential approval goes up. As the economy turns down, maybe it correlates a little bit with that. Certainly events cause a spike, sometimes a large spike. Stock market, 9/11, as you mentioned, up and down, et cetera. We have not seen that. And so, how I interpret that is when you just see partisans are locked in and they're not going to say, not going to give, on the other side, you're not going to give the other guy to say anything good about him. If you're on, his side, you're going to say, it's always good. Frankly, we see this with the economy too. And this is interesting because when we have folks rate the economy, to some degree, we see that partisanship, if their party is in power, have tended over recent years to give the economy better ratings than the party who's out of power, no matter what it's doing. In fact, Republicans had a rise in their evaluations of the economy right after President Trump took office. And so, the way you unpack that, I think,
you're saying that Republicans before President Trump was elected didn't think the economy was doing as well as
After
And then
he took office.
afterwards, he took office. That's all
Yeah.
he did was take office, and now the economy's doing better in their mind.
Yes, yeah. After he took office, they gave it better ratings. But look, the reason for this, the reason for this is partisanship plays a factor in how you make decisions. But we can't just diminish that. If you think about it, if I ask you, if I call you on the phone and say, what do you think? How's the nature of the economy? How's the economy doing? How would you answer that? Right? If you want to take it as a purely objective measure. Now you've got to go recall information, and which set of information? Should you remember how the stock market closed or how it's been doing? Well, you might if you have money invested, but if you don't, you might not be paying attention. Do you know the unemployment rate? In where? In your area, in the state, in the nation? You may not. Or maybe you recall how maybe some of your neighbors are doing. Should you think about your own pocketbook? Should you think about, well, do I have more money, less money? How am I doing? Should you think in terms of optimism, how you might do, right? How is it that you ought to evaluate the economy? It sort of turns you into an instant economist. It's not unreasonable to have people just say, well, if my folks are in charge, probably all else equal better. If my folks aren't in charge, maybe it's all else equal not. It's not, entirely irrational to think that way, but it does sort of give you a little bit of insight also into how people make decisions or come to opinions.
You talk about the partisanship, and you note in your book that when you talk the question came up about would you invite somebody over of a different political persuasion, and 66% of conservative Republicans said no, they would not. 62% of liberal Democrats said no. So how does this divide get undivided?
Well,
with that kind of mentality.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what you're referring to is, we try to measure how people see the other side. And we also know that a lot of people tell us they feel that conversations are getting harder to have. And we just did a poll this weekend where 84%, I think it was, of people told us they felt like the level of civility was getting worse. We know that people increasingly feel like they only want to talk or only do talk and hang around with people of the same political persuasion. We ask this. We ask, are your friends and family voting the same way you are? In large measure, people say yes, they are. And we know from other research that, the big sort and other trends that people are living more in counties that vote the same way around people who vote the same way as they do. One of the things I try to assert as perhaps a role of, if not polls, then how people read polls, is that done well, a poll can at least explain why people think the way they think. And maybe even if you don't agree with somebody, instead of thinking, that poll must be wrong, or, that can't possibly be the majority or the minority, if you try to get a sense of how people are thinking, maybe you can get a little bit more understanding of somebody who's different than you and maybe have a better conversation, or at least maybe have an entree in a conversation. Or if you're really into politics, maybe you can try to persuade somebody, right? Oh, that's why the other side came to that opinion. I read that in the poll. They all thought, this policy really helped, and they all thought this really made a difference. Well, I disagree, but I know you thought that. So that's information you can use if you want to have that discussion with other people. Maybe that makes it a little easier. If that's a bit of an entree, because people definitely say that they want more unity and that they want better conversations, and so maybe that's one small step towards it.
You point out another possibly not so small step, that a poll can be a dossier on democracy for you. It's an actionable intelligence.
Yeah, well, that's part of it. If you're having a conversation, if you want to have a conversation, if you want to try to change somebody's mind, right? Now you know what somebody else thinks and maybe a little bit of why they think it. And this is why, again, I also kind of emphasize for folks to look past the horse race in politics. We see we see plenty of horse races. We show them on the news. I talk about them. Horse race is, in fact, it's not a great analogy. It's not really a horse race. It is a dialogue. It is a persuasion effort on the part of people in campaigns. So if you look past those numbers and you see a poll that asks some interesting questions, and that is, in fact, what we do. We try to ask people questions. Then maybe you get a sense of that's why they think the way they think. And maybe that helps.
One more thing, which is an age-old poll question, which is, are you better off or worse than your parents? That's one that just keeps coming up and coming up. And it's a way of measuring the middle class. Do I have that right?
Well, I think the sort of traditional conception of the American dream part of it, right? It can mean many different things to different people, but is that each generation will do better than the next.
Right, but until 2008. 2008 was a game changer for that question, as I understand it.
Yeah, and one of the things we've seen and that other researchers have seen doing polls, especially on the millennial generation, is that people who came of age after the crash have oftentimes expressed, if not lessened optimism, but also a sense of the economy itself may not just be doing better or doing worse, but that may not operate in the same way, that it may not be giving everybody, and they tell us in the polls, a fair or an equal opportunity. And that's one of the things that I think sort of describes or helps explain some of the political narrative as well. Some of the pushback against, we see a decline in belief in trust in institutions. We see increasing numbers and many people who say that they feel the economy doesn't necessarily work for the middle class, and most people consider themselves middle class. And again, as a generation, it will be interesting to watch, especially as the economy sort of, has returned now and people saying it's good, whether that skepticism still remains is definitely a key thing to watch.
If we look at 2020, what kind of messaging do the politicians have to put out to get people's attention?
Well, I'm not a campaign strategist, but
well, what do people want to hear? What do they don't want to hear?
Well, here's what we know this. You're going to start to see 2020 polls. In fact, I think you have started to see.
They're out today.
They're out today. Okay, great. Not from me, at least as far as long as I can avoid it. The reason being, I think the 2020 polls you'll start to see are, Democrats' choice for nominee in this list of names. Not really very helpful information as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't mean at some point I may not end up doing one, but not very helpful. And here's why, right? I'm old enough to remember when Jeb Bush was the leader and the front runner for the Republican nomination. Okay, were those polls wrong? Right? Nobody comes and yells at me and says, "Oh, your polling was all wrong. We had Jeb Bush winning the Republican nomination." No, because there's enough time period, that things change, the political reality changed. But those polls were measuring something at the time. What was it they were measuring? Just like right now, what are the 2020 polls measuring? It's name recognition, right? So it's you're not, a person at home probably isn't going to pick from a list of people a name they have no idea who it is. So tends to happen is the most famous person just floats to the top, and maybe a point or two difference between a couple of equally famous people. But that's what you're getting in that. You're getting name ID, and then people might act surprised when somebody new comes out of Iowa and catches fire, et cetera, et cetera. But from a polling standpoint, again, it's sort of back to that lesson of know what you're measuring and know the story that the numbers are telling. They can be accurate, but they may not really be telling you what you think or what they purport to be.
Well, you look at somebody like a Jimmy Carter, who kind of came from a governorship, relatively small state, medium-sized state, and became president. I mean, could that happen today, given the media, given the...
That's a good question. I mean, look, we look at Bernie Sanders in 2016, right? I mean, There was a guy from Vermont that certainly wasn't.
true.
He didn't become. Obviously, he didn't win, but he certainly got a lot of votes, and he certainly drew a lot of support there, and made the primaries go on longer than I think a lot of people thought they would have at the start of that process. And so that's kind of the fun part about American politics, right? Is that you don't know these things. And I think that's sometimes part of the argument too, between the small states holding primaries and caucuses versus the big states like a California holding primaries, and when those things happen, right? The arguments, of course, being the small states lets you have the sort of retail politics, the handshaking that lets somebody who maybe isn't as well funded kind of start to meet people and break through. The counter argument to that is, well, hey, wait a second, these big states, they carry more weight by definition. They have more diverse electorates, the kind of people ultimately this person has to appeal to. That's the real test. And that argument, I think, we'll probably have for all of 2019. I got to get through 2018.
Yeah.
I've got to get through. I've got to get through 2018
I guess
first.
before we go to questions here, I mean,
Yeah.
what are you looking forward to for 2020, and what are you dreading for 2020?
Oh.
I suppose.
Well, like I said, I got to get through 2018 first. So assuming everybody likes the polling in 2018. But 2019, I do hope, is about explaining why people either do or don't think their prospects are good in the economy, why people think either they do or don't, feel like America is, going in the right direction, and sort of taking it from, and I will certainly try to take from, not simply issues and what policies you want, but why it is that people come to the decisions that they do, and what the landscape is in terms of the electorate, what kinds of constituencies there are out there, rather than as a horse race among personalities. For the pollsters' bias, if you will, is that it should start with what people are thinking and what they want, and then ultimately, if you measure that right, ultimately the candidate, I think, that fits that is the one that emerges.
I think a lot of people hope you're right.
Yeah, well, we'll see.
I have some questions now.
Yeah.
How does racial bias and AI, meaning artificial intelligence, play into polling?
Well, the artificial intelligence part, I'm not sure. Is whoever wrote it, if you want to maybe
elaborate? Is
elaborate,
that the bots
I would
out
find that
there
helpful.
that are
It's okay if you don't.
helping us think different ways?
I mean, what I would say this generally. I think that there's obviously a lot of discussion about the impact that social media has, about how we can measure and understand behavior based on what we see online. That's something that a lot of smart folks are trying to quantify and trying to measure. On one hand, we know, take Twitter for example. We know that not everybody is on Twitter. I saw some survey, I think it was Pew, I don't want to misquote it, but there was some like 20% of people who were on really active. And whatever subset of that is out there, there's an even smaller subset of people who are on it all the time and posting and exchanging, etc. And yet it kind of feels like it's got more influence than just those numbers might suggest, because even if you don't see a tweet on Twitter, you might see it flashed on your TV screen because a TV station reported it and talked about it as news, etc. So it's got larger influence than that. We're not exactly great at quantifying what that is yet. And the other part of it too is you might be often preaching to the choir with whatever messages are coming through social media. So we know, the folks, I think MIT has done this, Pew's done this, we know that there are networks, rather distinct, left and right, on social media and on the net, where people are following and reading websites that are already in line with what they believe, and less following and reading places that would contradict things that they already believe. So whether or not that has influence and can motivate or change people's minds might be partly a function of what those networks look like.
We talked about this afternoon that when, say, a politician goes out and gets a lot of attention for a speech, usually a sitting president, President Obama did this, President Trump is doing it now, can you see in the polling that you're doing constantly any impact of that?
It's hard in this environment because, as I was mentioning earlier, the numbers are so partisan they don't move that much. The president's numbers are very stable, no matter what. I think that it's often. Here's how I'll look at it. If I'm putting together a survey or we're talking about what to poll on, if the president or a major figure has put a topic on the table in a speech, has raised an issue that then people start reacting to, now that issue is in the public sphere. Now we have to see, is this something that's really resonating? Is this something we can really measure? We should talk about. And that's one of the things and one of the challenges of being a news pollster. And I will tell you, it's a real challenge as the news cycle gets faster and faster. Mm-hmm. And so, even if it takes 3 or 4 days to do a poll, really, no matter how you do it, who knows 2 days into a field period if some new topic is going to come up that, I didn't put a question on about that because it didn't come up. The good news is sometimes we can do another poll fast, but the fact that that's changing, or that even a story and the dynamics of a story change so fast now, always kind of is something I have to keep an eye on. It's something I have to really watch and be concerned about. For that very reason, things spread so quickly now.
Well, are you keeping an eye on the Cavanaugh Effect as to how long that lasts?
I know this, yes, but
women voters.
I know this. We coming into it, we asked, how are you going to feel if your side wins, loses? If we knew Democrats were opposed to the nomination. How would you feel if he gets seated on the court? They said angry. We knew Republicans were in favor. How would you feel if he doesn't get seated? They said angry. We polled everybody afterwards. Guess what? They were angry. The Republicans were enthusiastic. Democrats were angry. We also know that anger correlates with enthusiasm and propensity to turn out. So all those folks who said they were angry were more likely to say that they were turning out. However, just quickly sort of talk about enthusiasm for a second, because you'll hear that word a lot. Enthusiasm is not the same as turnout. Enthusiasm went up among Republicans, but the intention to turn out expressed between Democrats and Republicans, I've had it being even for quite some time. Like I always say, people talk about enthusiasm. You can only fill in that oval so hard. You can only whack that lever so hard. You get one vote, and from a polling standpoint, that counts as one vote.
Well, thank you, Anthony. That's
Sure.
fascinating. And that's all we have time for tonight. And on behalf of the World Affairs Council, I asked you once again to join me in thanking Anthony Salvanto for
Thanks.
this wonderful discussion.
And thank you.
And many thanks to you, the audience,
Thank you.
for terrific questions.